Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. So today we're continuing our series on the basic rhythms of Christianity. We talked about creation last week. Today we're going to talk about the fall. We're going to talk about sin. And the word that comes to my mind is dislocation. Things are not the way they're supposed to be. If you dislocate an ankle or a wrist, it doesn't work right. That's not how it was supposed to be, and it has to be fixed. And that can be a painful, challenging process. But for it to be repaired, takes work, takes time. There are plenty of other ways we experience this. Think about if you've ever pulled leftovers out of the refrigerator. Maybe you've taken a bite without looking, without paying attention, and all of a sudden your whole body recoils because you realize they've been in the fridge longer than you thought, and it's not the way it's supposed to be. You think about that as you spit it out into the trash can. Or how many of you have ever watched a movie on a plane? I was recently watching the latest Mission Impossible on a flight from San Diego to Atlanta on Friday. At least I think it was the latest one. They all kind of seem the same to me at this point. But watching this action movie with these big dramatic shots on this 8-inch screen on the back of a headrest, listening to it in headphones with the drone of an engine in the background, and you realize this was made to be experienced on a massive screen in a movie theater with surround sound, and to experience it in that way, not crammed into a plane with 200 other people for hours upon hours. Life is filled with these moments. Some of them are very somber and serious. I think most of them are. Every time we experience a loss in our lives, in our relationships within ourselves, we feel that it's wrong. There's a sense that things are off. This is not the way it's supposed to go. I think we feel it most in the death of the young. I think about when I was 19 years old. One of my closest friends died suddenly in the middle of the night. We were young. We were invincible until suddenly we weren't. And I was lost someplace between anger and despair for a long, long time because it felt unfair. It felt wrong. It wasn't the way life was supposed to go. We knew that in our bones, but we were stuck with the reality we had no matter how much we didn't like it. We had to accept that this is the way things are. There are some days I still get upset about that, and I'm willing to bet that you have at least one loss in your life that sits on you like that. The thing that just aches some nights, that gnaws at you because it wasn't supposed to be like this. Now, if human beings are just some evolutionary accident flying on a random collection of atoms through a cold and lifeless space, why do we feel this way? If all we are is random molecules assembled for a time in a world where the strong dominate the weak, and death is the one constant, the one dependable, then why do we feel this way sometimes, that things are so wrong? If you've ever watched more than 3 minutes of any nature show, you know that nature is merciless, that death is constant. And it usually preys on the weak. It's the strong eating the weak. And if this is all there was, then shouldn't evolution have prepared us for loss and death? Because it's been surrounding us for millennia and it doesn't appear to be going anywhere. But we experience loss, we experience pain, we grieve because we're more than just random accidents hurtling through space. We grieve loss because there's something written on our hearts that points beyond sin, beyond pain, beyond death, to a world where such things do not exist. We weren't made for disappointment. If we're made in the image of God, then clearly the image of God does not include these things. But somewhere along the way, we chose this, a terrible choice, one we'd give anything to undo. But it was made, nevertheless, through deception. We may start with asking, hey, were Adam and Eve real people? Did the account in the garden really happen like that, or is it some myth, some fable? I can't say for sure, but I can say that the Bible, throughout the Bible, treats them like they're real people. And other leading biblical figures talk about them like they're real people. And the Bible doesn't portray it as myth or a fable. So I'm going to choose what the Bible portrays as history should be treated as history. Similarly, people wonder, is the devil real, or is this just, again, some made up part of the story? All I can say is that Jesus took the devil very seriously. And if I'm going to stake my life on the words and the example of Jesus Christ, then it'd be very hard to cut out all of his teachings and all of his discussions and his interaction with the demonic world. Therefore, my thought is that the devil is real. And if the devil has the kind of power that we see throughout the Gospels, throughout the New Testament, then using a serpent to tempt Adam and Eve wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility. So I choose to believe that this happened as it is portrayed in Genesis chapter 3. And so remember where we were last week. Adam and Eve had been created in the image of God, planted in the Garden of Eden. All is good. They're given dominion over all of creation. God rests on the seventh day, signaling the completion of creation. Adam and Eve have this beautiful relationship with God, where God has provided for their every need. As the psalmist says in the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Adam and Eve are experiencing that. But then the serpent comes along and plants the seed of doubt in Eve's mind that she then goes on to water, and it grows and it grows. The woman says very clearly to the serpent that God told them not to eat of the tree, that they would die. But the serpent tells Eve, you won't really die. And then all of a sudden there becomes this mistrust. Eve begins to wonder, can she fully trust God? Is God reliant? Will the tree really kill? Or is God holding back? Is God holding out? Will that fruit give her something more that God won't for some reason? Right? God has given her everything she needs, but she suddenly begins to think that the tree can give her even more. She's thinking beyond her needs, and that's what sin does. It distorts our hearts and our minds so that we no longer trust God. We begin to think that we must rely upon ourselves, to set God aside, to set our desires front and center. Martin Luther called the heart a factory of idols. We suddenly want things that we hadn't wanted before, and we start to wonder what we need to do to get them, because God might not come through. Suddenly wants become needs. I was riding in this rental car on Thursday. I had this massive glass roof, and I'm sitting in there in sunny San Diego weather, and suddenly I become aware that I need this in my life. Hadn't known it until Thursday, but now I need one. And now I need to figure out how to get this need, because God might not work things out to supply my newfound need. So I need to spend some time working on this. As Genesis says, it was a delight to my eyes. That's what sin does. It deceives our senses. It leads us astray through this momentary delight. We get caught up in what we're experiencing. We stop thinking about long-term, and we make all these short-term decisions led by our senses, not by our faith. Sin has been doing this for thousands of years, and it's really good at it. We're all Adam and Eve, suddenly mistrusting God, letting our senses lead us into these short-term decision-making that isn't based on the promises God has for us. We do it together, too, just like Adam and Eve did. This wasn't just Eve's doing, as much as Adam tries to pin it on her, showing how sin destroys relationships. They were in this together, from sin to shame, hiding from God in their nakedness, afraid of the God they had mistrusted. They had broken the relationship with God, and it remains that way to this day. Paul references this in Romans. No one seeks God fully. We have all turned aside. Every aspect of our being is impacted. Here's Eve and Adam, spiritually broken. They no longer trust in God to provide for their every need. Here's Adam and Eve, mentally broken. They use their powers of discernment, but now they're using them in disobedience to the word of God, focusing on the forbidden fruit, delighting in it despite God's prohibition. Here's Eve and Adam, physically broken, taking and eating. And then they begin to experience death. Here's Adam and Eve, socially broken, sharing in sin. And the relationship is now marked by mistrust. We experience sin in the same ways. Spiritually, we're alienated from God. We don't fully trust God for our every need. We're suspicious of God's motives. Mentally, we twist our minds, we rationalize, we hide our sin, we divide, we blame. We deal with anxieties, all sorts of mental health issues. These are the after effects of the reality that things are no longer the way they were created to be. Physically, sickness, death, our bodies do not work as they ought. We age. Socially, we're a divided people between classes, political parties, countries, religions, denominations. We compete. We exclude. Sin impacts every part of life, and it's rooted in what happened here in the garden in Genesis 3. This is not the way it was designed to be. We're dislocated. Adam and Eve experience that physically, right? They're moved from the garden out, moved from that location. And this is the result. God gave us freedom, because love cannot be loved without the freedom to choose otherwise. And with that freedom, we choose sinful independence. We suffer from that choice every day. But the good news of the gospel is that the choice that is made in the garden does not determine our eternity. There is hope, and this is why the Psalm 13, is so important. Think back to what was read. In Psalm 13, the psalmist is wondering, how long will God forget him? He's filled with sorrow every day, filled with defeat. He's near the point of death, but the psalm ends with this joyous expectation of deliverance. The psalm ends with this testimony to God's steadfast love and salvation that are at complete odds with the beginning, where the psalmist is wondering if God has forgotten him. The psalmist is wailing at the start, singing at the end, and you might wonder, has he lost his mind? But he hasn't. He's got a thorough understanding of how God works. The psalmist knows God will deliver because God has promised to deliver, and God always keeps God's words. So this is a psalm that anticipates the deliverance before it even comes. Even though it seems like the enemy is winning, the psalmist knows the battle belongs to the Lord, and there's such a complete trust that's rooted so deeply in the psalmist that he's able, in the midst of despair, to anticipate the deliverance that he knows is coming. If the psalmist can pray like that in the midst of despair, how much more can we? Even in the midst of our experience, the dislocation, the brokenness, the reality of sin, we know it well. But we not only have the same promises that the psalmist have, we have something more. We have the one to whom the promise is pointed. We have the promise himself. We have the story where Jesus stepped in and made a way through sin, demonstrating that most fully in the resurrection, where he showed the defeat of death, the ultimate consequence of sin. He took the punishment for sin upon himself. All of the ramifications of sin, which therefore didn't have to fall on sinners, but they fell on him. We have this gospel good news. We have seen the deliverance. So when we, like the psalmist, get upset, when we ask God big questions, and we should, because the Psalms show us that it's okay to ask God big questions, but we can do so from a place of trust, not accusation, because we can rely on God supplying our need. We don't have to truly wonder if God will, or if God cares, or if God is paying attention. Because God has demonstrated fully God's ability and desire to deliver us from sin and death, from dislocation. And we're going to talk more next week about redemption. But it's important that we move through sin before we arrive there. And we acknowledge that we are sinful, but we are never without hope because we know that our Redeemer lives, and that allows us to deal with the reality of sin and brokenness in our lives and in our communities and in our world and every time we read the newspaper. But we can do so from a place of hope because we know God will redeem it because of what God has already done.